Hello and welcome to TV Tangents. I just got back from a midnight screening of Star Wars The Force Awakens, and I'm here to give you some spoiler-free impressions. I think by discussing the film rather than TV, this might actually be the most tangenty episode of TV Tangents I've ever done. And I'm just going to repeat that this is a spoiler-free impression, meaning that you'll find no plot details here whatsoever, but do check out our podcast, which is coming out in the next couple of days, as we'll have a much more in-depth analysis of the film, including spoilers. Also worth noting right up front that I am a massive Star Wars fan. So while I'd love to pretend that I could be 100% objective giving my thoughts on this film, I think that I'd be kidding myself. So that may not be possible, but I will try my absolute best to be as balanced as I can. So ultimately, the headline is that I really thoroughly enjoyed this film. It's not without its flaws, don't get me wrong, but I do think the vast majority of people are really going to love it. Now, this may seem like a really odd thing to pick out to start with, but the one thing that struck me straight away was that the narrative of this film flows in a very natural way. You may have noticed watching the prequel trilogy that the pacing is sort of all over the place. It sort of stops and starts all the time in order to sort of thrust exposition down your throat to try and sort of catch you up on what everyone is doing and why. And ultimately, I just think that's bad writing. The script just does not find a cleaner way to progress the story. In The Force Awakens, however, the story is sort of stripped back and you sort of understand everyone's goals very quickly and events unfold in a very logical way, flowing from scene to scene the way a good script should. The problem, being honest with you, is that the film spends most of its time sort of mirroring the original trilogy, which allows it to perfect the formula rather than innovate. Sadly, this means that there are very few surprises here for the hardcore Star Wars fans. But with that said, maybe that's the point here. Re-establish the formula in this particular film in order to sort of innovate and subvert it in its sequel. Of course, one of the advantages to echoing the original trilogy is that leads to a lot of fan service, some of which lands really well. Admittedly, some of it does land a little flat. It'll be interesting to see how some of that plays out in repeat viewings. Thankfully, on the positive side, this film, like A New Hope, isn't too interested in giving you the excruciating political blow-by-blow of the state of the galaxy. No discussion of the taxation of trade routes can be found here. And yet they don't leave the audience in the dark. Again, like A New Hope, they keep the correct balance of information and do a great job subtly suggesting what a post-Empire universe looks like without killing the film's pacing. It's enough to inform the story without hampering it. I like the new characters very much. They all felt sort of distinct and lovable really quickly, and I think that their interactions are actually one of the film's best selling points. In terms of performance, I think Adam Driver's sort of menacing Kylo Ren pretty much steals the show. And without spoiling anything, of course, the original cast, as we all know, are back, and they are mostly put to great use here, I think with one exception, which obviously we'll save for a more spoiler-filled discussion. Visually speaking, I think this might be the best Star Wars movie ever made. The attention to detail and sort of the love of the craft are really obvious in every single frame of this film. And of course, the much publicized return to practical effects is indeed a great choice. I think people in costumes and makeup that are enhanced by CGI are always going to work way better than completely CGI creatures. Although worth noting, there are a couple of completely CGI creatures as well. They blend in well enough. It's worth noting that I saw this film in 3D. I found it fine. Some shots even benefited from the sort of extra depth the 3D sort of adds to the image. But I think on the whole, I wouldn't say 3D was necessary here. Truthfully, my biggest complaint echoes my biggest problem with Age of Ultron. I didn't feel like I got a full story here. A New Hope works entirely on its own, and while this film does have a beginning and middle and end, I think the balance is slightly off, and one too many of the threads are left open once it's finished. So I think the problem there is that in parts it ends up feeling more like a setup for its sequel than it does a film in its own right. And again, only in parts. The interesting thing about that criticism is that The Empire Strikes Back arguably suffers from the same issue. It spends a lot of its runtime setting up things that don't pay off until Return of the Jedi, and yet amongst fans, Empire is considered one of the best Star Wars films that have been made. So can that really be aimed as a criticism at this film if it's doing the same thing one of the films that's widely loved did? Each on their own merit. If we're doing each on their own merit, That's that's a fair criticism. If we're looking at it as a saga, if we're looking at it as a whole, will the payoff be worth it? Getting more time to do it that way. It's really hard to say at this stage, obviously, but it's worth noting that is there, and I think some people will find that to be problematic. But even with all that said, I would still say The Force Awakens was an absolute joy. It's not without flaws, as we've been through, but it is fun, action-packed, and full of genuine adventure. And if I'm being honest, I think it feels more like a Star Wars film than any of the prequels ever did. So that's everything for this week's TV Tangents. Of course, for a more spoiler-filled view, do check out the podcast. Of course, you can always subscribe to the channel for more content. I appreciate we haven't posted much in a while, but I promise you in the new year we're going to have a lot of content like this, so do feel free to subscribe. But otherwise, that is everything for this edition of TV Tangents.